Hello dear viewers, a very warm welcome to our channel. It's very good to have you here. In this video we are going to have a look at things that can shorten the life of your starter motor. Right here you see a starter motor installed on a diesel engine. The duty of the starter motor is when it receives electricity from the ignition key through this line. This is terminal 50 coming from the ignition switch. It will activate the solenoid and the solenoid will engage this pinion to this engine flywheel, and the flywheel will be rotated by electric supply from the battery. So the starter motor main duty is to convert the electrical energy coming from the car battery to mechanical energy that is used to crank the flywheel, crank the engine and start it. Now there are some mistakes that can shorten the life of a starter motor. You know, starter motors are expensive these days, so it's a good idea to identify what are some of the mistakes that can lead to shorter starter motor life and avoid them. Well, the first and most common starter motor killer is frequent starting. If there is something wrong with the fuel system or with the ignition system of your vehicle and it refuses starting and you repeatedly crank, and that can shorten the starter motor life. Frequent start, especially in a short time frame, can put excessive strain on the starter motor, leading to premature starter motor failure. What happens is when there is frequent electric flow through this coil and through the field winding inside the starter motor, that will overheat, and when it overheats, insulation will fail, and finally the starter motor will fail as a whole. So the number one killer of a starter motor is frequent starting. So try starting your engine. If it refuses to start in a couple of cranking, then you have to identify what is preventing the engine from starting. Otherwise, if you continuously keep on cranking your engine, that will result in overheating of the solenoid, overheating of the starter motor, and failure of the starter motor prematurely. The other thing that can kill a starter motor is when there is low or weak battery supply to the starter motor. You know, the battery voltage that is supplied to the starter motor has to be sufficient enough to allow the starter motor produce enough torque to crank the vehicle. A weak or a failing battery can cause the starter motor to work harder than it should, which increases the risk of overheating and damage. So, condition of the starter motor really affected by the status of the battery. The third problem that can lead to starter motor failure is poor electrical connection. When there is corrosion or loose connection that can lead to insufficient voltage reaching the starter motor, it will cause it to draw more current than it should and leads to potential overheating. There are electrical connections here. This is terminal 30 of the starter motor, which receives battery voltage from the battery positive, and right there is terminal 50, which receives electrical supply from the ignition switch. And when the starter is mounted onto the engine frame, it will receive battery negative. Now, if these connections are corroded and somehow generating electrical resistance for a smooth current passage, that will cause the starter motor to overheat and it will cause the starter motor to fail prematurely. So poor electrical connection is the third cause of a failing starter motor. Worn out ignition switch can also cause a starter motor problem. If the electric supply to terminal 50 is not continuous, if it is intermittent, sometimes when there is a problem with the ignition switch, then we will have intermittent electric supply to the solenoid that can cause intermittent starter motor operation. That will cause starter motor failure. Early starter motor failure can result as a result of poor electrical supply from the ignition switch. Faulty ignition switch can cause the starter motor to engage intermittently or remain engaged for longer than necessary, leading to engine overheating. Once the ignition switch is released after the engine has been started, the starter motor has to withdraw the pinion from the flywheel. Otherwise, if the pinion keeps engaged to the flywheel, then the engine will be driving the starter motor at extremely high speed, and that can cause failure of the starter motor. It can lead to denaturing or dismantling of the armature because the armature will be caused to spin at extremely high speed. Now, this can happen when there is a problem with the ignition switch that is supplying battery voltage to the terminal 50. If the driver releases the ignition switch has to instantly interrupt power supply to terminal 50 of the starter motor. If terminal 50 keeps on receiving power, that can lead to starter motor engaging longer than it should, causing damage of the starter motor unit. So a faulty ignition switch can also be problematic. Others are mechanical issues that can lead to starter motor problem. For example, problem with the engine such as a seizure if the engine is not freely rotating, issues with the flywheel that can prevent the starter motor from turning over smoothly, increases stress on the starter motor. Somehow the engine crankshaft, it has to be free. It has to be free to allow the starter motor to crank smoothly. But if there is a problem with any of the cylinder, for example, if there are seized parts, that will make turning the crankshaft or turning the flywheel very difficult, causing the starter motor to draw extremely massive amount of current. And when that massive amount of current flows through the winding, it will overheat and the starter motor will fail. So mechanical problems like a seized engine, somehow preventing the starter motor free rotation, can cause premature starter motor failure. Environmental factors can also contribute to starter motor failure. Such things like problem with the extreme temperature, both hot and cold, can affect battery performance and starter motor operation as well. Cold weather can increase the viscosity of engine oil, making it harder for the starter motor to turn and harder for the engine to turn over. So extreme temperatures can also impact the service life of your starter motor. Improper installation can also be a problem. Once the starter motor is serviced, it has to be installed in proper match. If it is somehow misaligned, if the starter motor is not installed correctly, it can lead to misalignment or improper engagement with the flywheel, causing premature wear. So the alignment of the pinion to this ring gear, it has to be properly maintained. Otherwise, if it is misaligned, those misalignment can cause premature pinion failure. Premature starter motor failure can result as a result of misalignment. Overuse of accessories can also be problematic. Using electrical accessories while starting the car, for example, using headlight while starting the car, using other electrical accessories that can draw much current from the starter battery, can cause less electricity to be supplied to the starter motor, leading to premature starter motor failure as well. Age and wear is another problem that can cause a starter motor failure. Older motors may be more prone to failure due to wear and tear internally. And finally, poor quality parts are also cause for premature starter motor failure. Using low quality or incompatible replacement parts can lead to premature failure to the starter motor as well. Regular maintenance and addressing any electrical or mechanical issues promptly can help you extend the life of your starter motor. And whenever replacing component is very crucial, whenever replacing components is mandatory, you have to use original parts so that the starter motor can serve you for long. For example, if the starter motor brush has to be replaced, you have to use original brush. Otherwise, local parts, inferior parts, can cause premature failure of the starter motor. So these are some of the things that can kill your starter motor. We have looked at 10 things that can cause premature starter motor failure. By avoiding this, you can prolong the service life of your starter motor. Well, dear viewers, that is all we have for you regarding some of the things that can shorten the life of your starter motor. If you find this video helpful and if you like what has been presented, please smash the like button. If you are new to this channel, do consider subscribing, turn on notifications so that you will be the first to get notified whenever we come up with another video. Until then, stay safe.